everybody, it's Mr. Wagstaff. So we're starting our Economic and Personal Finance course, Unit 2, here with micro and macroeconomics. So we're going to talk all about that in depth as an introductory version of those two things upcoming. However, we're going to reference something called inflation and deflation a ton in this course, and I want to spend a whole day to present it to you. Now, instead of just teaching you the lesson as I could sit here and do, I actually have already taught this lesson. I actually taught it 2 years ago in American History 1, which is a course that we don't teach anymore. So I have this lesson, and it does a really good job with some props that I don't have access to right now. That's why I'm doing that instead of redoing the video. But I think you will enjoy it. I'm going to talk about the late 1800s situation called the populist movement in order to explain inflation and deflation. The only real difference here in the day-to-day setup of the rest of the stuff in our course is the fact that today, the way I recorded it back then is it's not going to like stop and like the question will appear behind me and I like pause me, answer this completely and move on. The questions won't actually show up. They're there on your sheet to answer as you go through, but you will need to make sure to pause it yourself when you get to those questions because there won't be me saying to pause you. So, think you'll like this. Let's get started. Because there is a thing called the populist movement that happens in the late 1890s where the farmers in America get mad. And they get very mad at a very complex situation, all right? So it's on this idea of trying to base money on the gold standard. Now, this is the single most, I'll make myself bigger here so I can, this is the single most complicated concept in American history, all right? It is extremely complicated. So I'm not going to try to race through this. I'm going to explain it to you. I fully expect that you are going to understand this very complex idea of inflation and deflation, basing money on the gold standard and all that here shortly. But before we get started, get loosened up, all right, because you got some thinking to do. You got to follow me here and put on your thinking caps. Put on your thinking caps. No, all right. I know you're not putting on your thinking caps. I can see you. All right. And I'm a little disappointed in that. You know what? I guess I'll just put on my thinking cap. All right. Because when you get ready to talk about something tough, you got to have your thinking caps on. All right. I'm really hoping y'all don't actually not have a thinking cap. This is like a real thing. It helps you think. So this is my thinking cap. So I got it on so I can teach you the most effective way possible. All right. Let me teach you about some inflation and deflation. All right. Man, I feel smarter already. Put myself up here in the corner. All right. So all this stuff here is in your notes, but I'm going to go and try to tell it to you story-wise. All right. This is a guy. We're going to call him Bob. All right. So let me tell you a story about fictional Bob here. All right. And how life and money works in present-day society using a fictional character, Bob. This is Bob, all right? So Bob, just a guy, just a normal guy, nothing, there's no backstory to Bob. Bob just like, poof, Bob exists, whatever. There's Bob. Bob, all right, just go with me on this. Bob, in the year 2020, right, decides to buy a house. So he buys a house and he pays $100,000 for it, all right? He pays $100,000 for this house. Now, Bob doesn't actually have any money. So how can Bob buy a house if he doesn't have any money? Well, what Bob does is he borrows the money from a bank. He goes to the bank and says, hey, bank, can I have some money? The bank's going to say, sure, Bob, here you go. And the bank is going to give Bob money. Now, the bank doesn't give Bob money because they're just being nice. Bob's going to have to pay that money back plus interest. All right. And so interest is like thank you money for loaning me the money. So not only does Bob have to pay back that $100,000, he'll end up paying back a whole lot more than that. Here's a little thing that you may have heard in previous courses, but I think it's worth noting. If Bob gets a $100,000 loan over 30 years at 4% interest, this is where my thinking cap comes in, all right? Bob, 4% of $100,000 is $4,000. So how much does Bob have to pay back? Where you're like, well, he owes $100,000 plus the $4,000, he owes $104,000 back to the bank. No. That $4,000 is how much he has to pay as thank you money every year until he pays off that $100,000 over the course of 30 years. So $4,000 times 30 is $120,000. That's how much money Bob will pay in thank you money in addition to the $100,000 he borrowed. Bob will pay back $220,000 on a $100,000 loan. That is why the banks are more than happy to give people money, because you have to pay it back. This is how America works. All right, that's not something shady in the 1800s. That's how loans work present day. This is why banks give out money, is because they make a lot of money by loaning people money. All right, so I'm getting a little off base here. Here's what you have to understand about Bob's loan. This is really important, and this is how loans work. So it's a 30-year fixed mortgage. All that means is no matter what happens, his debt doesn't change. It doesn't increase, decrease. And he's just methodically paying it off every month. And after 30 years, he's paid off his loan. He will officially own the house because the bank owns the house until Bob pays it off. He gets to live there, but they technically own it. All right. So the way it breaks down to all math calculations, click, he has to pay $800 a month in his mortgage. Like, it's like mortgage is like rent, but you own it, so you're paying off a debt, so it's called your mortgage. So Bob pays, I'm just making this up, $800 a month is how much Bob has to pay every month for 30 years. Now, if you're going to go try to do all the math and be like, well, does that add up to, there's taxes and other stuff. So it's variables. That's more of an economics discussion. All right. So Bob pays $800 a month every month for 30 years. So in 12 years and 3 months from here, so in the year 2032, how much will he pay every month? $800. It never changes. So for 30 years, he pays $800 every month. He has to make that payment, or the bank's going to come take the house back. You with me so far? Good. All right. So what this means, though he lives in this house, he doesn't actually own it. Bob is $100,000 in debt. That's kind of how society works. People take out loans. Very few people have $100,000 up front to go buy a house with. All right, so Bob had to borrow it. So this puts Bob in debt. Most Americans, like 90+% of Americans, are in debt where they are paying off loans of some sort. Typically, house and car are the two most common loans that people have. Also, student loans, which is a whole different. I don't even want to go into that category. Ignore I said that, because that's a whole different thing. But houses and cars are the most common form of debt of things that you own in America. All right. So Bob's $100,000 in debt. Most Americans are in debt. Now, you're like, okay, cool. I'm cool. I know what Bob says. So we're going to come back to Bob in a second here. But I wanted to give you that precursor to Bob before I start talking about what is really important here. This concept of inflation and deflation. All right. So here's kind of the first rule to this whole concept we're going to talk about, that don't ask me why this is like this. It just is. Money every year is either going to increase in value or decrease in value. The paper dollar bills that you have, it either increases every year or decreases. money can never remain the exact same value year in and year out. Why is that, Mr. Wagstaff? I don't know. I need more lights, I guess. That's super complex of why money has to change value. It just does. It does it naturally. All right. So when the value of the dollar, all right, if it's stronger or weaker each year, it varies. There's two different terms for that. It's inflation or deflation, whether or not the value of the dollar goes up or the value of the dollar goes down. Now, for those of you that really like details, I got a really good graph right here. All right. If you want to pause me right now and look at this graph, this is a really, really good graph. If I try to go over this graph, about half of the people are going to stop watching me right now, so I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go back to Bob and try to explain inflation and deflation using Bob. But if you like details and accurate stuff and not Mr. Wagstaff in a stinking cap, pause me right now and read this and understand this and you're golden. But this is pretty complicated, so I'm going to step you through. We're going to go back to Bob here in a second. So inflation, and we're going to go back to Bob here, but I want to give you some ideas on inflation and deflation. Inflation means the value of the dollar goes down. All right, and you actually lost value of the dollar. So inflation, even though it sounds it means going up, it means the value of the dollar goes down. The reason it's inflation is you need more dollar bills to buy the same thing. All right, so money has to be based on something. We were at one point based on gold. Instead of people just carrying around gold, we had money that represented gold, so you could just use the money, and then you could take that money to the bank and they would exchange it for the equal amounts of gold. All right. So money was representative at gold at one point. All right. So if you just printed more money, say, you don't have more gold. So if you print more money, you don't actually have more value. You just have more dollar bills, but the same amount of gold that the money represents. So every time you print more money, it actually makes the money worth less because it takes more dollars to equal the same amount of value. If that's like above your head, let me give you a simpler example here. In 1970, a cup of coffee cost 25 cents. 2019 cost $1.59. The exact same cup of coffee. Why did the prices increase? Because money has started to be worth less over time. That's called inflation. All right. So the value of the dollar has gone down. Now, here's what also has happened. In 1970, your minimum wage was probably like $1.25. In 2019, I think the minimum wage is $7. All right. So while the prices increase, people get paid more. So the person who could afford this in 1970, the equivalent person can afford it the same way in 2019. So while prices go up, so does paychecks. All right. Now, deflation is the opposite. It would be that money, all right, it becomes worth more and the price of everything plummets. So like if deflation was happening, where the value of the dollar goes up and the prices go down, because it takes less money to buy something. All right. If this was 25 cents, this would probably be like a nickel, right? And the prices would go down. Now, we're slowly getting ready to go back to Bob, and I want to explain deflation more in detail here. Deflation is really bad for America. If money is worth more, it is devastating to America. And I'm going to explain to you why. So I do have a little cartoon here, kind of threw it in here in case it clarifies. This is supposed to be representing inflation. This is somebody, he's tearing money in half. He's giving him half, and he's going to keep half. He's like, hey, we both have money, but it's not actually, you haven't increased the value. You just doubled, like you have two pieces of money now. It doesn't actually mean it can buy double. It's a different way of looking at inflation. All right. So let's get back to Bob here. All right, let me get back to Bob, and let's talk about some of Bob's finances. Now, you guys stay with me because this ends up being a very important story in U.S. history. All right. So Bob Bob, we'll say Bob makes $2,000 per month at his job. All right, he makes $2,000 per month. All right, so if inflation, keep in mind he owes $800 a month for his mortgage, so he has to pay $800 a month. All right, if inflation happens, all right, which means the price of everything goes up, Bob will actually start getting paid more money. Now, I mean, if gas is $7 a gallon, like, oh no, but then Bob makes a lot more money, they even out. You can buy the same amount of stuff. That's called your cost of living increase. If prices go up, you get paid a little bit more. So we'll say inflation has been happening, where the prices of everything keep going up, so Bob gets paid a little bit more to keep up with that. Bob makes $2,700 a month. Well, here's where it's important, all right? His monthly payments on his debt are still $800. He's been locked into that debt. So even though he makes more money now, he still only has to pay $800 a month in debt. So it's actually beneficial for him, somebody that's in debt, to have inflation happen, because that amount of money is locked in of what you borrowed. That's what you have to pay back. That doesn't change. So when inflation happens, and yes, prices are going up, but people start getting paid more, it's easier to pay off your debt. So inflation is good for poor people and people that are in debt, all right? Because when you get more money, it's easier to pay off your debt. Are you with me? Good. Because let's talk about what happens. This one here says how deflation affects Bob. We'll start out. Bob makes $2,000 a month. You can already see it. Bob is upset. All right. He was happy. Oh yeah, Bob's already getting irritated here. So if deflation happens, the price of everything goes down. All right. Bob will gradually start getting paid less because of the cost of living decreases. Like, hey, gas is a nickel. Great. A new iPhone, brand new, the iPhone 42 or whatever it'll be. $75. Instead of being over $1,000, it's $75. Hooray! However, Bob, instead of making $2,000 a month, now only makes $700 a month for his job because everything's so cheap. How much is his debt? His monthly payments on his debt are still $800 a month. That does not change. Yet he only makes $700 a month. Uh-oh. That's not good for Bob, who's in debt. Bob, oh, he's real upset now. Bob, the bank takes Bob's house, all right? And that's called a foreclosure because he stopped making payments. They take his house and Bob loses everything because of deflation, and Bob is completely devastated here. Here's poor Bob, all right? Bob's a homeless person now, all right? So how does deflation affect the rich? Because in that situation, you're like, man, everybody should hate deflation. No, they do not. You know why they don't dislike deflation? Because if you're rich and you just have a bunch of money already, when deflation happens, your existing money becomes worth more. You don't have to pay off debt because you're rich. You already own everything. So rich people can just sit here and hold their money and it just becomes worth more and more and more. And rich people love deflation, but it is absolutely astronomically, catastrophically, negatively impactful on poor working Americans, people like Bob here, who is now a homeless person, all right? Because he can't pay his debts. When deflation happens and the value of the dollar goes up, you can't pay your debts, all right? So this is a rich banker guy who's super happy, loves this, all right? But it destroys most of America. Now, the majority of America is poor. Still is today. I shouldn't say poor, in debt of some sort. All right, the vast majority are. In the 1800s, it was even more than that. Guess who got to make all the laws? The rich people. The rich people made the laws. The rich people are the ones who made the laws because they, all right, the rich people are the ones that make the laws because they control Congress with the robber barons and these rich guys. They absolutely like deflation. All right. So if you have a decent understanding of inflation and deflation and which one is good for who, all right, then we can move on and talk about this story. And the story is pretty straightforward if you understand inflation and deflation. All right. After the Civil War, let me back up. Civil War cost a bunch of money. You need millions and millions and millions of dollars in the Civil War in order to pay off this ridiculous amounts of debt that you have. Well, the problem with that is the United States government doesn't have enough money to pay off all their debts. So they do the dumbest possible thing that they can do. They just print off a whole bunch more money. It's hopefully you talked about this in economics. This is like the worst possible thing that you can do. You cannot print money and think you're making more money. Money has to represent something. It was based on gold. They just said, nah, we're not going to base it on anything. Print off as much as you want. It's called greenbacks. That was the name of the money during the Civil War. It was called greenbacks. It was completely worthless. It was awful. It was horrific. All right. Greenbacks were awful because they basically became worthless. It caused massive inflation. So even though the greenbacks became worthless, who did massive inflation benefit? The poor people. Because when you have all this useless money, it's real easy to pay off your debts when you were loaned money when that money was actually worth something. You can pay it off real easy. It's like you're paying it off with monopoly money. Hooray. All right. Well, the bankers and those guys, those are the rich guys. They don't like this. All right. Inflation makes all their existing money worth less. So after the Civil War, we're here in the late 1800s. It is obvious that we have to fix the money in America. All right. So the rich people who control Congress, all right, and really control the laws, they're like, all right, let's just go base the money back on gold again. If you take money that was based on nothing, hopes and dreams, and you base it on gold, is it going to be more valuable? Absolutely. What's that called? Deflation, because the value of the dollar went up because it takes less dollars to buy something, so that's why it's deflation, but the value of the dollar goes up. It's called deflation. That benefits the rich. Who is it awful for? It's awful for the poor people. So the rich people want to change it back, what's called the gold standard. Base money on gold. When this gets brought up, all the farmers in the middle of the country are furious and they're horrified. Yes, they were given all this land with the Homestead Act because they had $0 to their name. But how did they build their houses and their barns and buy their seed? Is debt. They had to borrow the money and they're paying it off each year. If you base money on gold, there is no way they will be able to pay off their debts. Now, the farmers aren't crazy. They realize that you got to do something. They don't want money based on gold. The farmers want it based on silver. So rich people want money based on gold, so it can be worth more. The poor people and the people in the middle of the country want money based on silver. They had to create their own political party called the Populist Party, made up mainly of farmers in the middle of the country. And there's a ton of them who are going to say, you cannot base money on gold. If you base money on gold, you're absolutely going to destroy us, and there's nothing that we can do. So they want it based on silver because silver is still a precious metal, but it's more abundant than gold. That's why it's not as expensive. So they want it based on silver. They actually advanced their thinking into something called bimetallism. They're like, well, here's what we'll even do. We can even base it on like a little bit of silver and a little bit of gold. This way we can, by adding how much you want to base it on, you can actually control the value of the money moving forward. So all the farmers in the middle of the country are like, yes, we need to base it on bimetallism, absolutely. And they created a political party. The political party is so strong that the Democrats actually had to join the Populist Party because the Populist Party had gotten more popular than the Democrats. Now, in the North, it's still the Republicans. And these are the big robber baron guys, and they're like, we can just ignore what all these poor people want. We don't care about them. So the Populist Party basically gets ignored in 1896 when they're running for president. So not only is the Populist Party the farmers who want money based on bimetallism or silver, anything but gold. Going on the gold standard is awful. Here's who they run for president, is William Jennings Bryan. All right. So William Jennings Bryan is the most famous preacher of the time. So William Jennings Bryan, he runs for president in 1896, and he's going to lose, but this is what's going to be really important here. He runs for president because he's nominated by the populist and democratic parties. So they combine and they run him. This is him holding a cross. He is a preacher, very famous. He toured the country promoting bimetallism. Basically, do not go to the gold standard. This is, and he has a very famous speech. All right, and they a lot of times like to ask you this on the test, like I will. It is called his Cross of Gold speech. The Cross of Gold speech says that farmers are being crucified by the gold standard. That if America goes to the gold standard, it is equivalent of like executing the farmers. Because that's what the crucifix is execution of Jesus. He's a religious symbolism. All right. So his Cross of Gold speech says, if you go to the gold standard, you're going to wipe out your farmers. They're not going to be able to grow food anymore. And you're going to kill the entire country because everybody's going to starve to death if you cater to the rich people. The Republicans are like, we're going to the gold standard. Who cares? So in the election of 1896, it is William McKinley, all right? And we'll talk more about him as this unit goes on. William McKinley, he's basically the lapdog of the robber barons. They chose him to like, yes, you go be president. And he's going to run against, ho-hum William Jennings Bryan. Whoever the robber barons pick always wins in a landslide. Well, McKinley does win, but all the blue states, they all voted for the other guy. They all voted for William Jennings Bryan. All right. So this is the election of 1896. This is how third party and non-major parties are very influential. Even though McKinley won, he realized, and yeah, it's 271 to 176. It doesn't seem that close, but it really was. I mean, this is crazy. Like that, this means people would vote against you. It's usually just this, but it is obvious that this whole idea of the gold standard is an extremely divisive concept. So yes, when McKinley comes in, I think they technically say they're going to go to the gold standard because there is a law that says they're going to do it. But they realize that there is so much anger against the gold standard that they can't truly commit back to the gold standard. And McKinley actually does it. Even though he says he's going to do it, they actually cater very much to the populist party, the farmers in the middle of the country. So much so that 4 years later in the election, when William McKinley runs for re-election, and William Jennings Bryan runs against him again, this is the map right now. This is the next year. All these states right here changed their votes and voted for McKinley again. Because McKinley understood you can't ignore this massive amount of the country. So the Populist Party is very famous for standing up against going back to the gold standard because it would only benefit the rich people and would be absolutely astronomically negative to the poor people and the people that are in debt. This is a photograph of William Jennings Bryan a few years later. All right. So that's as far as we're going to get today. I'll take off my thinking cap. What just happened? Where am I? Oh, did I put the thinking cap on again? Oh.